He thought he could break her in front of everyone, turn her into a joke to impress the room. But he had no idea he had just chosen the one person who never needed to prove anything to anyone. The dojo smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant, the late afternoon light slipping through tall windows and stretching across the mats in long golden lines. And that was when Eleanor Hayes stepped inside, quiet, almost invisible, wearing a plain gray hoodie and worn sneakers that didn't belong in a place where discipline and rank were everything. And for a moment, no one noticed her, not until Jason Cole did. Jason stood at the center like he owned the air everyone breathed, a third-degree black belt with a reputation that filled the room before he even spoke. And when his eyes landed on Eleanor, there was a flicker of amusement, the kind that came from seeing something he believed didn't belong, something easy. He tilted his head slightly, smirk forming as the chatter around him softened into curiosity, because in places like this, hierarchy wasn't just respected, it was enforced, and Eleanor looked like she had none. She walked calmly toward the edge of the mat, her posture relaxed but precise in a way that was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, and she set her small gym bag down without a word, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, though no one there recognized her, and that was all Jason needed. He took a step forward, the faint squeak of the mat under his foot echoing just enough to draw attention, and the room shifted toward him like it always did, because he was used to being watched, used to being the center of every story told in that space. And today, he decided she would be part of it. "You lost?" he asked casually, the kind of tone that sounded polite until you heard the edge underneath it, and a few students nearby exchanged glances, already sensing what was coming, because Jason didn't ask questions unless he already had an answer in mind. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes steady, not defensive, not impressed, just present, and she shook her head slightly. "No," she said softly, her voice even, almost gentle, and that should have been the end of it, but Jason let out a short laugh, just loud enough to invite the room in, just enough to make it a performance. "This class isn't for beginners," he continued, gesturing vaguely at her clothes, her quiet demeanor, everything about her that didn't match his world, and a couple of people chuckled under their breath, not cruel enough to be obvious, but not kind enough to stop it either. Eleanor didn't react, didn't shrink, didn't argue, and that stillness, that lack of response, only made Jason lean in further, because to him, silence meant weakness, and weakness was something he knew how to handle. "We train seriously here," he added, his voice dropping just enough to sound like a warning wrapped in instruction, and the room grew quieter, a subtle tension threading through the air as everyone waited to see what she would do, because moments like this always turned into something. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver, her breathing slow and controlled, her hands relaxed at her sides, and for a brief second, something almost imperceptible passed through the room, like a shift in weight no one could quite explain, but Jason didn't notice it. Or maybe he did and chose to ignore it, because he had already made up his mind. He smiled, that confident, practiced smile, and gestured toward the mat. "Why don't you show us what you've got?" he said. And just like that, the trap was set, the audience was ready, and the story he thought he was about to tell had already begun to unravel in ways he couldn't yet see. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't the weakest, just the one who knows exactly when to move. And when she finally does, the room doesn't laugh anymore. Jason did not wait for her to answer again, because in his mind the moment was already decided, already shaped into something that would end with laughter and a quiet reminder of who belonged and who did not. And he stepped back onto the mat with a confidence that filled the space, rolling his shoulders slightly, as if preparing for something routine, something easy, while a few students shifted closer along the edges, their sneakers brushing softly against the floor, drawn in by the promise of spectacle more than concern. "Just basic sparring," he said, his tone light, but carrying a weight that suggested control, as if he were doing her a favor by allowing her to stand there at all. And someone in the back let out a small laugh, quickly covered, but not unnoticed, because in rooms like this, even the smallest sound could tip the balance of dignity. Eleanor stepped forward without hesitation, her movements unhurried, placing herself across from him with a calm that did not match the tension building around them. And for a brief second, the light from the window caught her face, revealing nothing but stillness, no trace of fear, no sign of urgency, just a quiet presence that did not ask for permission. Jason raised his hands into position, demonstrating form with exaggerated clarity, almost like he was teaching, almost like he wanted the room to see how far above her he believed he stood, and he glanced at the others as if to say, "Watch this," as if this moment belonged to him. And the room responded in kind, bodies leaning in, eyes narrowing, phones subtly lifted by a few who did not want to miss what they assumed would be a quick and harmless lesson. "You can stop anytime," he added, though the way he said it made it clear he did not expect her to. Not really, because stopping would mean admitting she did not belong, and that was the point. Eleanor nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and then she raised her hands, not in a show of strength, not in imitation, but in a way that was simple and efficient, like someone who did not need to think about where they should be. And for a fleeting moment, the instructor standing near the wall shifted his gaze, something about her stance catching his attention, something he could not immediately explain. But before that thought could settle, Jason moved. He stepped forward with controlled speed, not reckless, not uncontrolled, just enough to close the distance and demonstrate authority. And the air seemed to tighten as he approached, the kind of pressure that made people hold their breath without realizing it. And yet Eleanor did not move back, did not flinch, did not rush. She simply adjusted her footing by an inch, her weight settling evenly, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes fixed not on his hands, but somewhere deeper, as if she were reading something beyond motion. Jason paused for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough to register as a flicker in his rhythm, because he had expected hesitation, expected uncertainty, and what he saw instead was something else entirely, something that did not fit the story he was trying to tell. And still, he continued, because stepping back now would mean losing control of the moment, and control was everything to him. Around them, the room grew quieter, the earlier amusement fading into something more attentive, more cautious, as if the space itself was beginning to realize that this was no longer a simple demonstration, no longer a predictable outcome, and Eleanor remained exactly where she was, steady, composed, her breathing unchanged, her presence unshaken, and in that growing silence, the first cracks in Jason's certainty began to form, though he did not yet understand why, and that was the moment. Everything started to shift, long before anyone could see it clearly, long before anyone was ready to admit it. Jason moved again, this time with more intent, his steps measured but firmer, the kind of pressure that was meant to close space not just physically but psychologically, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed by those watching, because even without understanding technique, people could feel escalation when it entered a room, and what had started as a demonstration was quietly becoming something else. Eleanor remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her shoulders loose, her gaze steady in a way that did not challenge him yet did not yield either. And that balance, that quiet refusal to react the way he expected, began to pull at the edges of Jason's control, though he masked it with a slight tightening of his jaw and a sharper focus in his eyes. "Stay with me," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more directive, as if trying to reassert the structure of the moment, to remind both her and everyone else that he was still leading this. And a few students nodded subtly, as if aligning themselves with that authority, because it was easier to believe in the familiar than to question it. He advanced again, this time faster, his movement clean and disciplined, stopping just short of contact, testing distance, testing reaction. And in that instant, something became clear to him that he did not like, because Eleanor did not recoil, did not overcorrect, did not freeze. She simply adjusted, a small shift of her weight, a slight angle of her stance, efficient and precise, like someone who had already calculated the space before he moved into it. The instructor by the wall straightened slightly, his arms uncrossing without him realizing it, his attention narrowing, because what he was seeing no longer fit the pattern of a beginner under pressure. And yet he said nothing, because uncertainty often chose silence before it chose intervention. Around them, the earlier murmurs had faded completely, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier than noise, the kind that made every small movement more visible, more significant, and Jason felt it, that subtle change in the room's attention, the way it was no longer entirely on him. And that realization pushed him forward again, not recklessly, but with a sharper edge, a need to restore the narrative he had started. Eleanor's breathing remained slow, steady, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm untouched by the pace he was trying to set, and her eyes did not chase his movements. They anticipated them, settling not on what he was doing, but on what he was about to do. And that was where the difference lived, quiet but undeniable. He circled slightly, adjusting his angle, trying to find an opening, and for a brief second, their shadows stretched across the mat in the late sunlight, overlapping in a way that made them look almost equal, and something about that image lingered longer than it should have. A student near the back lowered his phone without realizing it, the expectation of an easy moment slipping into something harder to define, because the tension now was not about whether she would fail, but about why she had not yet, and that question hung in the air, unanswered but growing. Jason stepped in once more, committing just enough to force a response, and this time Eleanor moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, controlled adjustment that redirected the moment without breaking it. And in that single motion, subtle as it was, the balance shifted, not visibly enough for everyone to understand, but deeply enough that those paying attention felt it immediately, like a quiet current changing direction beneath still water. Jason paused again, just for a fraction, but longer than before, and in that hesitation, something unspoken passed through the room, a realization not yet formed into words, but impossible to ignore, because the person he thought he was leading was no longer following, and the story he thought he controlled was beginning to write itself in a way he could not predict. By now the room no longer felt like a class. It felt like a question waiting to be answered, and no one could quite name it, but everyone could feel it settling into their chest, tightening the air between each breath, because something about Eleanor no longer matched the story they had accepted just minutes ago. Jason shifted his stance again, slower this time, more deliberate, his confidence still present but no longer effortless, as if he were recalibrating in real time, trying to understand what exactly he was facing without admitting that he needed to understand it at all, and that subtle tension showed in the way his shoulders held just a fraction tighter than before. "Focus," he said, though now it sounded less like instruction and more like a reminder to himself, and a few students exchanged glances, sensing that the tone had changed even if they could not explain why. Eleanor did not respond, not verbally, not emotionally. She simply remained there, grounded, her weight balanced with a precision that did not shift under pressure, her eyes steady, watching not with urgency but with clarity, and in that stillness there was something unmistakable, something that did not belong to beginners or casual learners, something earned through time and experience that could not be faked. Jason stepped in again, this time committing to a sequence designed to control space, to guide her movement, to remind the room that he dictated the rhythm. And for a moment it worked, the motion flowing as expected, the kind of pattern everyone in the room recognized, the kind that usually led to a clear outcome. And yet Eleanor moved with it in a way that did not resist and did not submit. She simply redirected, each small adjustment dissolving his intent without breaking form, without creating spectacle, as if she were rewriting the interaction from within it. A quiet murmur almost formed at the edge of the group, but never fully surfaced, because something about the moment demanded silence instead, a deeper attention, and the instructor by the wall took a step forward now, not intervening, but no longer passive, his eyes narrowing as recognition began to flicker behind them, something distant, something he had seen before, but could not yet place. Jason felt it too, not the recognition, but the loss of certainty, the way his usual control was slipping into something less defined, and that was when his movements sharpened, not reckless, but more assertive, as if pushing harder would restore the balance he expected, and for a brief second the pace increased, the air tightening again, the tension rising to a point where everyone leaned forward without realizing it. Eleanor responded the same way she had from the beginning, calm, efficient, her breathing unchanged, her posture unwavering. And then it happened, not a dramatic shift, not a sudden burst, but a single, precise movement that interrupted the rhythm entirely, a motion so clean and effortless that it did not look like resistance at all, yet it stopped Jason's progression completely, leaving him momentarily without direction. His momentum paused in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. The room froze, not because something loud had happened, but because something undeniable had. And for the first time, Jason did not immediately continue. He did not fill the space with motion or words. He simply stood there for a fraction longer than before, and in that pause, the truth began to surface. Not spoken, not declared, but understood in the quiet way that certainty replaces assumption. Because the woman he thought he was testing was no longer a question. She was the answer, and he had just realized he did not know it. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the room like a weight that no one wanted to disturb. Because now every person there understood, at least in part, that what they were witnessing was no longer a simple exchange. It was something revealing itself layer by layer. And Jason stood in the center of it, no longer performing, no longer certain. His breath just slightly heavier than before as he recalculated in a way he had never needed to in this space. He straightened subtly, as if resetting himself, pulling back into the version of control he was known for, because stepping away was not an option, not here, not in front of everyone who had always seen him as untouchable. And yet the confidence he wore now was different, thinner, stretched over something he could not fully hide. Again, he said quieter this time, the word landing without the earlier edge, and it was less a command than a necessity, a way to reclaim ground he felt slipping beneath him. Eleanor inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgment, and then she returned to stillness, the same calm presence that had not changed since she first stepped onto the mat, her breathing steady, her posture aligned, her focus unbroken, and that consistency, that refusal to be shaken, became more unsettling than any sudden action could have been. Jason moved forward once more, this time with greater care, his steps measured with precision, testing not just distance but understanding, searching for a pattern, a weakness, something he could recognize and respond to, but Eleanor gave him nothing that fit into anything familiar, each of her movements existing just outside the framework he expected, not resisting directly, not yielding either, simply guiding the interaction into spaces where his usual control could not settle. Around them, no one spoke, no one shifted. Even the smallest sounds seemed to fade as attention narrowed completely onto the space between them, and the instructor now stood closer than before, his expression no longer neutral, his eyes fixed on Eleanor with a growing certainty that he was witnessing something rare, something he should have recognized sooner. Jason adjusted again, circling slightly, trying to reset the rhythm, and then he committed to another controlled advance, more deliberate than before, designed to re-establish structure. And for a moment it seemed as though he might succeed, the movement clean, the timing sharp, the kind of execution that had always defined him. But Eleanor responded with the same quiet efficiency, a minimal shift that dissolved the sequence before it could fully form, not interrupting it forcefully, but absorbing and redirecting it with an ease that felt almost effortless. And that was when it became undeniable. Jason stopped, not abruptly, but fully, his movement ending in a way that did not continue into the next action, his eyes locking onto hers as something new settled in his expression, not anger, not frustration, but recognition, the kind that arrives when the truth finally outweighs assumption. And for the first time since this began, he did not look at her like she was beneath him. He looked at her like he did not understand her. The room held its breath, the air thick with the realization spreading silently from one person to the next, because now it was clear that Eleanor was not trying to keep up. She was allowing the moment to unfold, choosing when to respond, choosing how much to reveal, and that choice, that control, shifted everything. The instructor took one more step forward, his voice almost forming before he stopped himself, because even he understood now that whatever this was, it was no longer his to interrupt, and Eleanor remained exactly as she had been from the start, calm, grounded, untouched by the pressure that had defined the room just minutes ago. And in that stillness, in that quiet certainty, the balance had already tipped beyond return, leaving Jason standing in a moment he no longer owned, facing a truth he had not prepared for, and the room, for the first time, was no longer waiting for him. Jason did not move right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, carried more weight than anything that had happened before, because for the first time the rhythm of the room was no longer dictated by him. It had shifted into something quieter, something steadier, something that belonged entirely to Eleanor. The light from the windows stretched further across the mat now, the golden lines softening as the sun lowered, and in that fading glow, every detail seemed sharper, more defined, as if the moment itself wanted to be remembered clearly. Jason exhaled slowly, resetting his stance once more, but this time there was no performance in it, no need to impress. Only a careful focus that replaced the confidence he had relied on. And when he stepped forward again, it was different, not an attempt to dominate, but an attempt to understand, though he would never say it out loud. Eleanor watched him without tension, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, and there was a quiet clarity in the way she held herself, as if she had already seen every path this moment could take and had chosen the simplest one. He moved with precision, closing the distance in a controlled sequence, and for a brief instant it looked like the structure he knew so well might return, that the familiar patterns might reassert themselves. But Eleanor shifted just slightly, a movement so minimal it almost disappeared into the flow, and yet it changed everything, guiding his motion away from its intended line without resistance, without force, just a redirection so clean it felt inevitable, and Jason felt it immediately, the loss of alignment, the subtle imbalance that left him without a clear next step. He stopped, not because he chose to, but because there was nothing left to continue from, and that realization settled into him with a quiet finality that no one could miss. Around them, the room did not react with sound. It reacted with stillness, a deeper silence than before, the kind that came when understanding replaced expectation, and the students who had once leaned forward for entertainment now stood completely motionless, their attention fixed not on what might happen next, but on what had already happened. The instructor took another step closer, his expression no longer uncertain, his eyes focused entirely on Eleanor, and in that gaze there was recognition now, clear and undeniable, as if a name hovered just beneath the surface, waiting to be spoken, but not yet. Jason lowered his hands slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgment, his posture shifting in a way that no longer carried authority, only awareness, and he looked at Eleanor again, truly looked this time, not at her clothes, not at her presence, but at the quiet precision that defined every movement she made, and in that moment he understood what he had missed from the very beginning. Eleanor did not press forward, did not take advantage of the space that had opened. She simply remained where she was, composed, grounded, her breathing steady, her control absolute, and that restraint spoke louder than anything else could have, because it made it clear that this had never been about proving herself. It had only ever been about responding when necessary. The air in the room felt different now, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, as if something invisible had been rearranged, and no one dared to interrupt it, no one dared to speak, because the truth had already arrived without needing to be announced. Jason took a small step back, not forced, not abrupt, just enough to create space. And in that single step the balance was restored in a way that could not be undone, not to what it was before, but to what it should have been all along, and Eleanor, still calm, still steady, allowed the moment to settle completely, as the room finally understood that strength did not need to be loud to be undeniable. No one told him to stop, and yet Jason knew that if he moved the same way again, the result would not change, and that realization settled into him with a quiet clarity that was far more unsettling than any defeat could have been, because it meant the difference between them was not in effort, not in speed, but in something deeper that he could not reach by trying harder. The room held that understanding with him, every student now watching not for action, but for truth, their earlier assumptions dissolving into a silence that demanded respect without asking for it. Eleanor remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her breathing even, her presence grounded in a way that felt almost immovable, and there was something unmistakable in the way she stood there, something that no longer needed to be proven because it had already been revealed. Jason lifted his hands again, but this time there was no show in it, no attempt to impress, only a careful, measured intent, and when he stepped forward, it was with a precision that came from awareness rather than ego, as if he were finally meeting the moment instead of controlling it. Eleanor responded with the same quiet efficiency, her movements minimal, her adjustments seamless, each motion aligning perfectly with his without resistance, without hesitation. And in that flow, something remarkable happened. The exchange no longer felt like opposition. It felt like understanding, like she was guiding the space rather than reacting to it. Jason tried once more to set a rhythm, a sequence he knew well, something that had worked countless times before, and for a brief second it appeared structured, controlled, familiar. But Eleanor moved through it as if she had seen it long before it began, her response not interrupting, not clashing, but dissolving each part of it with an ease that made it clear she was not keeping up, she was already ahead. A quiet shift passed through the room, not a sound, but a realization, the kind that moved from one person to another without words, because now it was undeniable. She was not learning in that moment. She was revealing something that had been there all along. The instructor finally stepped closer, his voice low but steady as it entered the silence. "That is enough," he said, not as a command to stop something out of control, but as an acknowledgement that what needed to be seen had already been shown, and Jason lowered his hands slowly, not out of defeat, but out of respect, his posture no longer carrying the weight of authority, only the quiet acceptance of what he had just experienced. He looked at Eleanor again, and this time there was no judgment in his eyes, no assumption, only a recognition that came too late to change how the moment began, but just in time to understand how it would end. Eleanor gave a small nod, not triumphant, not dismissive, simply acknowledging the space as it was, and then she stepped back, her movements as calm and unhurried as when she first arrived, and in that simple action, she made it clear that she had never needed the room to see her, only to let it reveal itself. The students did not move, did not speak, because they understood now that what they had witnessed was not about winning or losing. It was about presence, about control without force, about strength that did not need to be announced. And as Eleanor turned slightly, preparing to leave the mat, the silence followed her, not empty, but full, carrying a lesson no one would forget. Because sometimes the most powerful moment is not when someone proves who they are, but when everyone else finally realizes they were wrong. The moment did not end when Eleanor stepped back. It expanded, settling into every corner of the room like a truth no one could ignore. And for a few seconds no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because they understood that anything they did next would exist in the shadow of what had just been revealed. The instructor exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, and then he looked at Eleanor with a level of attention that carried recognition, not the kind that came from memory alone, but from experience, from having seen something rare before and realizing he was seeing it again. "Hayes," he said quietly, the name leaving his lips with a weight that immediately shifted the air, and a few students glanced at each other, confusion flickering across their faces as they tried to place it, because it was not a name they heard often, but it was not entirely unfamiliar either. Eleanor paused, just slightly, her hand resting near her bag, and for the first time there was a hint of something behind her stillness, not hesitation, but acknowledgment, as if she had expected this moment might come. She turned her head just enough to meet the instructor's gaze, and the silence deepened, because now the room was no longer waiting for action, it was waiting for understanding. "It has been a long time," the instructor continued, his voice steady but softened by something close to respect, and that was when the shift became complete, because the way he spoke was not how one addressed a beginner, or even a skilled student. It was how one spoke to someone who had already earned their place long before stepping into that room. Jason's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders easing, his stance no longer defensive or assertive, simply present, as he listened, because whatever this was, it mattered, and he knew now that he had walked into something far beyond what he had assumed. A student near the back whispered the name under his breath, testing it, as if saying it might unlock something, and another student's eyes widened slightly, recognition finally connecting, a memory of an article, a competition, a reputation that had once been spoken about with quiet admiration. Eleanor did not step forward, did not explain herself. She simply stood there, her presence unchanged, allowing the room to come to its own realization, and that restraint carried more authority than any declaration could have. The instructor nodded once, almost to himself, as if confirming what he already knew, and then he addressed the room, not loudly, but clearly enough that every person heard it. Some of you may not realize who you just trained with, he said, and a subtle tension ran through the group. Not fear, not excitement, but something closer to humility, because they understood that whatever came next would redefine what they thought they knew. Jason lowered his gaze briefly, not in shame, but in reflection, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet respect that had not been there before. And when he looked back up, it was different, not at Eleanor as an opponent, but at Eleanor as someone he had misjudged completely. Eleanor picked up her bag with the same calm motion she had shown from the beginning. Her movements unhurried, her expression steady, and as she turned toward the exit, no one stopped her, no one spoke, because they understood now that her presence had never required permission, and her departure did not need acknowledgment, it only needed silence. The door at the edge of the dojo opened softly, the outside light cooler now as evening approached, and as she stepped through it, the room remained exactly as it was, still, quiet, changed, because sometimes the truth does not arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it walks in unnoticed, stands in front of you, and leaves before you fully understand what you were given, and by the time you do, all that remains is the silence it left behind. The door closed softly behind Eleanor, and for a moment no one in the dojo moved, as if the sound itself had drawn a line between what they thought they understood and what they now knew they did not, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with reflection, heavy with the quiet realization that something meaningful had just passed through their lives without asking for attention. The instructor remained still, his eyes lingering on the door long after it had shut, and then he turned slowly back to the room, not with authority, but with a calm that carried something deeper, something earned, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before, measured, deliberate, as if choosing each word carefully. "There are people," he said, "who do not need to announce who they are, because what they carry speaks long before they ever say a word." And no one interrupted him, because no one needed clarification. The lesson had already been written in front of them. Jason stood where he was, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by rank or expectation, but by something quieter, something closer to understanding, and he glanced down at his hands briefly, not in defeat, but in reflection, as if realizing for the first time that skill alone was not the same as mastery, and confidence was not the same as awareness. Around him, the other students shifted slightly, not out of restlessness, but out of discomfort with their own earlier reactions, the laughter, the assumptions, the willingness to watch someone be tested without questioning why, and that discomfort settled into something more honest, something that would stay with them long after this day ended. The instructor walked toward the center of the mat, his steps steady, and he looked at Jason for a moment, not judging, not correcting, simply acknowledging, and Jason met his gaze with a quiet nod, a silent acceptance of what had changed within him, because some lessons could not be taught, they could only be experienced. Outside, the evening light had cooled, the sky shifting toward a deeper shade as the day moved on, but inside the dojo, time seemed to hold for just a little longer, as if giving everyone the space to understand what had just happened, not as a moment of embarrassment or failure, but as something far more valuable, a correction, a realignment, a reminder of what respect truly meant. No one spoke Eleanor's name again, not because it was forgotten, but because it did not need to be repeated. It had already settled into the room, into their thoughts, into the way they would carry themselves moving forward, and Jason finally stepped back from the center, not reclaiming it, but leaving it open, the way it should have been from the beginning. The instructor gave a small nod, signaling the class to continue, but the energy had changed, the movements quieter, more intentional, the focus no longer on proving anything, but on understanding, and as the sounds of practice slowly returned, they carried a different weight, a different meaning, shaped by what they had witnessed. And somewhere beyond the walls of that dojo, Eleanor walked on without looking back, her presence already gone, her lesson already complete, leaving behind nothing but a silence that spoke louder than any victory ever could, because that day, without raising her voice, without demanding recognition, she reminded everyone in that room that true strength does not need to be seen to be real, and respect, once understood, is never given lightly again.